Welcome to this webinar, and hopefully it will go as smoothly as possible. And the topic is tackling the cost of living crisis with data. And we have both Stuart and Paul from CACI. So I will pass over to Stuart now.
Great. Thanks, Erin, and thanks, LARIA, for inviting us to speak and open the session. And hope everybody on the session is well, and you had a good Jubilee weekend, because I know that I did. So what are we here for? We're here to talk about tackling the cost of living crisis with data. So I think, everybody in this room won't be immune to what's happened since the beginning of the year, and the fact is that we've been facing big challenges that have actually all contributed towards the rise in costs for everyone. And many experts are saying that this is going to be with us for quite some time. This also comes at a time where we're recovering from COVID and has massive implications for those who are less affluent population groups in our communities, as well as our wider economy. So with so much going on at the top of government at the moment, how much of this really is sensationalism in the media and that they're stirring up, and versus the reality of what's happening at the coalface? Well, you won't be surprised to learn that many of the conversations that I'm having with local government at the moment involves the cost of living crisis. In fact, it's actually the topic that people are talking about. But interestingly, the focus isn't solely on those people who are the most at risk and vulnerable in our communities, and this is largely because they are already in the system, but it's those who are likely to need support in the coming months and years. And these are traditionally people who are effectively one paycheck away from a disaster or a crisis, and they may not already be known to local authorities. These are people who are commonly known as just about managings or the squeeze middle. But if you don't know who these people are and where they are, then how can you actually begin to plan? So the positive that actually did come from COVID has been the recognition by a much wider audience that data is now at the heart of decision making, and many of our data sets are already being used by authorities to inform intervention strategies that can be rolled out as and when are required. Now, today's webinar is slightly different to our previous events in that we're tackling a subject that is relatively new and it's evolving. So we don't actually have any client speakers to give you any examples, but our presentation today will provide you with insights into what we think is actually really going on and how you can apply data to evidence decision making, connecting with your council's response as things develop over the coming months. And with this in mind, the presentation that my colleague Paul will deliver in a moment is based on three key issues or three key areas. One is, what is our actual understanding of the cost of living crisis? What consumers are telling us about it, and who and where will be most impacted? As data and insight is our speciality, we will bring all of this together and provide you with our recommendations for tackling the crisis using data. So without further ado, I will hand over to Paul and you can pick up from here. Are you there, Paul?
I am here, yes, and just had that moment of...
You were on mute.
Yeah. Okay, are we happy? Right, can you see the slides as well? Is that a thumbs up from you?
I can definitely see, yes,
okay,
definitely
that's
see it.
Fantastic. Okay, right, well, without further ado, let's start working through that agenda. So, yeah, thanks for that introduction, everyone. Okay, so what are we going to look at today? Well, let's start by setting the context and of this title of Understanding the Cost of Living Crisis with Data. So, whatever your news feeds, whatever you do, you will no doubt constantly be hearing about the cost of living crisis, and I'm sure it's coming in through your days of work. And yeah, we're finding we can't have a meeting with a client where we don't need to mention the cost of living crisis and how it is or might impact that work, whether that's with local authority clients or with our commercial clients. So as we did during the COVID pandemic, we want to start to get behind those headlines to see what's actually really happening and likely to happen next. So we want to help our clients to understand questions like this. Who is really being impacted? Where is being impacted or likely to be impacted? How will it impact your organization or our organization? And where should we, as organizations, intervene to help people? So what do people actually know about the cost of living crisis, as it's being called? Because there is so much noise out there, so many headlines. But actually, once we cut through the noise, I'm not sure that anyone really knows very much, other than costs are rising, it's going to get worse, and logically, but sadly, some will suffer more than others. So, as LARIA members that we are, and hopefully people like you, we believe that you need data to understand what's actually going on behind that problem. And without data, you cannot understand what's going on, so you cannot make interventions. And there's loads of data out there, but the trouble is there's even more gaps. So I've just sort of put up a few bits of data, and we get into a wonderful acronym soup if we want to here. So yeah, I've kind of split the data sets into public and another one I'll show you in a minute. So they're all flawed, but there are some out there. So CPI, consumer price inflation, useful data set, came out late May, so only a few weeks ago I was looking at it, but there's always a lag. The data was really up until late April, so it's already behind. It gives us some great headlines and some great trends in terms of what's going on in terms of inflation, but we never really understand what's going on behind those numbers. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, and we certainly don't know the who and the where that are going to be affected. So the second acronym, RSI, the Retail Sales Index, has the same issues. It has that month lag, and again, it can't gaze into the future. Now, I've been following a lot of headlines to try and understand and prepare for this talk. Again, the RSI data gives a great source of headlines and sound bites, but it doesn't tell us what is going to happen. We also can't tell from retail spend data if spend levels are going up as things are getting more expensive, or whether they're going down as we're cutting our spend. Similarly, if anyone's seen the news today, the British Retail Consortium, BRC, if you want the acronym, has come out with data around changing spend levels and says they've been dropping. But again, it has to put that caveat on of, but we're not sure how much they're dropping really, because things are getting more expensive. So we could go on, but yeah, ultimately there's various data sets. A new one that's quite interesting here is the fourth one down. The UK, the Bank of England with the ONS is starting to share credit and debit card data. It's a new experimental data set that might start to show some spend trends, and it has 4 spend categories that it's tracking. But again, it doesn't look at who those spenders are. And finally, another acronym at the bottom there, we have the inflation forecasts that the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, produces, which are, believe me, pretty hard to unpack for us lay people. So lots of data, hard to understand. So then you've got, where do you go next? Well, if we can't entirely rely on the public data, you can go to what I've called public announcements. And this is where you get anything ranging from Nestle saying they're increasing the price of a Kit Kat because of cost of living, through to Primark saying that they're going to have to raise their prices later this year. This data is useful to get a snapshot, but we're only seeing part of the story. And there is always an agenda behind those announcements. Are they trying to justify price increases? Are they trying to placate the city? Or in the case of charities and social organizations, are they trying to do a call to action or fundraising for those? And similar can be said for things like think tanks, so people like the New Economic Foundation or the Resolution Foundation, or research houses like GfK, Kantar, and YouGov. They're all producing endless sound bites and endless pieces of information out there, but they've always got an agenda. So much of what's out there will be providing excellent granular insights for the people who commission that research, but when it comes out as national headlines that we can read, it's mostly in the hands of the media, who use it in isolation and give a story that they want to push. So this is where we have come in. So what we are going to be trying to do during the cost of living crisis, and we don't know how long this is going to last, in the same way as we were tracking COVID, we're going to bring 4 new data inputs into a monthly voice on what insights are showing. So what we're planning on bringing, and some of these I'm bringing today, is we're asking people what they think and feel by doing a cost of living survey every quarter. I will be sharing the results of our first one today. We are going to be looking at how they are changing their spend by tracking transactional data that we have unique access to. We're also, and I'm going to touch on this today, looking at who and where is likely to be impacted by running scenarios on how people's disposable incomes are likely to change at a local and demographic level. And we're also going to be using that to forecast expenditure. So whilst we don't have a crystal ball any better than anyone else's, we think that these are going to bring something that on a free monthly basis, we can give our views on what is going on in the market. Now, this month, I'm just going to focus on the survey and the scenario piece, but behind the scenes, we're also setting up a transaction tracker that uses anonymized debit card data to look at how things are changing in terms of spend by type of people, type of product, and type of location. So let's look at what this is showing. But before I do, and apologies to anyone who has already had this introduction before, I'm going to, as many of you know, use Acorn, which is our classification. Give me 1 minute. I'm going to explain it because it's important that you understand it as we go through the presentation, because I'm going to use it to cut quite a lot of the data. So in simple terms, we classified people. There is a more detailed version that doesn't fit on the slide and makes your head hurt. But we've got these broad 5, what we call Acorn categories, so the different colors, the blue, the purple, the green, the orange, and the turquoise. Those are Acorn categories. Some of the work I will show looks at data at that broad level because of sample sizes. Generally, it's the most affluent at the top and the least affluent at the bottom. Okay, we are then going to drill in a little bit more detail into the broader Acorn, the more detailed Acorn groups that will give us a little bit more nuance. And you can see that there's a sort of life stage element coming in there. So little chart here, and we're sharing all of these slides, gives you a bit of a sort of a sense check that, yeah, Acorn B are executive wealth. They are a big group in the population. As the name would imply, they're reasonably affluent and they're just beyond the middle age. Then you've got, the youngest group of students down here. The lowest income groups are down at the bottom here. Okay, that's all that you need to know. Hopefully you can follow it as we go through, and your first Acorn slide is coming any moment. So let's start this section by telling you what our consumers, what individuals are telling us about their concerns around the cost of living crisis. So let's start with the big number. 56% of people that we polled last month are saying that they are worried about their personal finances. So that is a big, quite scary number. And actually, we asked various combinations of that question, and only 11% of people actually said, we are not worried. So there is clear concern out there. So as I said, we're going to look at this by demographics. What we can start to see here. So this is at the broad Acorn category level, the most affluent through to the least affluent. Clearly, what we can see immediately here is, despite the average being 56%, it's the urban adversity, the lowest income groups that are most concerned. Okay. I also cut this data another way. I've not put a chart up here, but it's also the 24 to 44-year-old group who are also the most concerned. Okay, so that is from asking people their views. We then drilled into asking, what do you think the impact of the rising cost of living will be on your household in the coming months? I'm going to be showing a chart. I'm going to break through this chart over a number of slides now to start to explain where people are going to start cutting. But yeah, what we can immediately see here is right at the top that 54% of people say that they are going to use less energy. That is the #1 place, loud and clear, that people say that they're going to try and cut their costs. So the message is clearly getting through that a clear driver of this cost of living crisis is energy prices. But whilst cutting your energy use may be good for meeting the UK's emission targets and may help with the response in the short term to the fuel crisis, it could have serious implications for those already who are using the minimum fuel and who are already the most vulnerable. And we are already having conversations with many of our utilities clients for who this is a major issue. And it's an area where local support is likely to be needed at a local authority level. Now, when I looked into the demographic responses, it was very noticeably actually the higher income groups, so the higher income groups that were most willing to cut here. This presumably reflects the fact that they have the most that they can save here, whilst lower income groups are already closer to the limit of what they can actually save energy on. So that's the number one place that people are going to cut their costs. Let's move down. Okay, so where do we next go to save money? Well, the next places are used by buying fewer smaller luxuries like takeaways, switching to cheaper brands, and deferring bigger purchases. Now, it looks like we're going to see a rise of value brands, and we've already seen this in previous economic shocks. And this backs up trends that we've seen in published data from people like Kantar, that Aldi and Lidl are seeing a rise in share. Now, the deferring of bigger purchases and the decreasing in spending could certainly have an impact on the economy. And this was flagged again in today's British Retail Consortium data. And many of our commercial clients are monitoring this situation very closely. So let's drill down on the next slide a bit further into the specific products that consumers say they will cut based on this question, which is what are you most likely to cut your spending on to help mitigate the cost of living crisis? Okay, so worryingly for our leisure clients, consumers look set to cut their spending in this sector pretty quickly. And it's only a sector that has only just started to recover from the impact of COVID. So if, as local authorities, you are reliant on leisure and tourism in your high streets, this could be concerning. Over 50% of consumers list various leisure options as their first place where they like to cut their spend. And the high street sector may face more worries, with 53% saying they will be cutting from spending on clothing. Interestingly, if we move further down that list, despite the big rising costs of travel, flights and trains are low on the list of cuts. I think this reflects everyone's desperate need to try and get away after so many months of lockdown. And this flights and trains thing is only a fraction below the level of groceries, where only 38% of people plan to make cuts. Now, we'll be watching this one very closely in our transaction data, where we may see that the share of spend allocated to groceries is likely to start to rise as consumers cut luxuries and the weekly shop becomes one of the last areas where cuts can be made. And finally on this one, our homes remain our castles, with home and house and home likely to be the last place where people in our panel would like to see cuts. Now, this again tracks with what we've seen in the past economic squeezes, with the home improvement sector generally proving pretty resilient. If we can't go out, we want to at least be living in a pleasant home environment. So let's go back to that first question of where you think you're going to be cutting or how you're going to mitigate the cost of living crisis. Now, working our way down this slide that we've seen before, the next place that we get to for cutting spending is by drawing down, well, isn't cutting spending, it's about drawing down on savings. So 26% of people say that they will need to draw from their savings in the coming months. Now, it was noted during COVID that after the initial fears of a financial meltdown, that many actually managed to increase their savings as they were forced to cut travel and treats. But what we're now seeing, despite this widespread concern about cost of living, only 26% say that they now plan to draw from their savings to help offset the fall in disposable income. So let's look at what's behind that figure. Okay. So this time I've cut the data by broad generation. The oldest at the top, the silent generation, those born before the end of the Second World War, through to Generation Z, who are now in their early 20s. And what we're seeing here is that almost twice as many in the eldest silent generation have made savings during COVID that they can call on than the youngest Generation Z. So this question was, during COVID, I increased my savings and now have more to spend before the pandemic. So almost twice as many in that top older group. Now, this is not to say that the millennials, now aged from their mid-20s to early 40s, and the Generation Zs didn't make savings. They just saved and then spent. Indeed, in another question, we see that over 50% of these two youngest groups say that they made savings and spent them, compared to 24% and 29% for the silent and baby boomer generation. Now, some may say this was frivolous and the younger groups should have saved. Others, probably those in those groups, will say that they spent on the things that they needed, like the new homes that had been beyond their reach before. But it's also not surprising that there's only 26% of people saying that they're going to be able to draw on their savings going forward, because a recent report by the Yorkshire Building Society shows that already almost 4 in 10 have had to dip in their savings in the last 12 months to cover their cost of living. So whatever the reason why drawing on saving is not for everyone, and why the younger generation might sorry, try that again. Either way, this explains why drawing on savings is not for everyone and why the younger generations appear more at risk. Now, not surprisingly, there is an Acorn angle here, with only 20% of urban adversity, the bottom Acorn category, saying that they now have more to spend. And even more worryingly, 24% of that same group say that they have no personal savings, in marked contrast to the top 3 Acorn categories. So, if you don't have savings and you can't easily cut spend, what happens next? Back to that same chart that we've seen before. Now, alarmingly, what we're seeing here is that over 10% of people are saying that they expect to go either overdrawn, use credit card to defer payments, or use even more risky buy now, pay later options in the coming months. Interestingly, the demographic patterns are not as clear as we may have thought here. The risk of going overdrawn seems remarkably flat. Other than the very affluent achievers, what we can see here is that more than 10% of every other group say that there is a risk that they will go overdrawn in the months ahead. So it is not just the lowest income that are running that risk. But the demographic differences really kick in when you look at the more risky buy now, pay later options. Here we see 18% of urban adversity and 15% of financially stretched risking using these more risky buy now, pay later options. Or, to put it another way, if we look at both charts here, we see that almost 1 in 5 of the least affluent households risk being pushed further into debt. And finally, on this point, a sobering statistic, 16% of urban adversity so that they may have to miss out on utility bills. Okay, the final part of this chart. At first, the likelihood of missing rent or mortgage payment looks like a low risk from the survey findings, as it has the lowest response levels into what people think will be the impacts on them. But any risk here is concerning. And unfortunately, when we unpack it further and we look at it by tenure, we see that the figures are higher. Firstly, the mortgage risk. This jumps up to 6% of homeowners with mortgages saying that they have that risk. But it's even worse for renters, who are even more concerned. Now, whether they are private renters living in shared accommodation or local authority tenants, whoever the landlord, about 10% of renters say that they are likely to miss rent payments in the coming months. And here, it is not just low income groups. So if I look at the likelihood to miss rental payments by Acorn, yes, I've shaded out the affluent achievers and the comfortable communities in the middle, but both the 2 lowest income groups and this rising prosperity group, which is urbanites, often relatively young, often on high rents, that group still says that 6% of them say that they may well miss rents in the coming months. So we have, across the demographic spectrum, risks there. Okay, and as we'll see later, this rising prosperity point is further supported by our analysis of the future cost of living scenarios using our PayCheck Disposable Income data, which I'm going to start to look at now. Okay, so far we have seen what individuals are saying is going to happen. But we also wanted to augment this with a second source. So we wanted to use something that gave more predictive insights. So to do this, we used our PayCheck and our PayCheck Disposable Income model data. We updated these in late May to take account of the latest current year figures and the price rises that have already taken place. Okay, this gives us a great base from which to run scenarios to understand who and where will be impacted in the future. Okay, so we've built a nice little forecasting tool that sits on top of this data that we can use for a range of different scenarios, and I'd like to share 3 of those with you now. Now, you can question my assumptions, and again, we're recording this so you can look through this in more detail, but I've used a wide range of my favorite acronym sources from the OBR to the CPI and RSI to build my assumptions. In this initial base scenario, I have made the assumption that the full gas and electricity price rises that were predicted before the Chancellor stepped in a couple of weeks ago were going to apply. So I have made an assumption here based on research that it's going to be about a 40% increase in people's gas and electricity bills. Now, once I've shown this scenario, we will then see why the Chancellor acted as he did and the potential effects of those actions on this initial base scenario I'm going to show. Okay, so based on the assumptions I've just showed, we estimate that the average household will see a fall in disposable income over the year of £212. But there's a chart there starting to get a little bit smaller. It's a more detailed Acorn group level, because as you know, we at CACI don't believe there is such thing as an average household. Whilst the slight rise here in incomes of the top 2 Acorn groups is due to the fact that their high incomes with pay rises are likely to actually go up and offset the rising costs, those at the bottom are likely to see drops of about 3 times the national average. So we've got groups down here seeing up to and just above £600 impact a year based on this scenario. But here we are still talking about averages in each Acorn group. So what we've then done is use our tools to look at how we expect the distribution to play out within these groups. Now, this is when we get some multiple colors on the charts. Okay, so the chart on the right shows the distribution of impacts on each Acorn group's disposable income. Let's start at the top, the highest income groups. In the top 3 Acorn groups, the large blue bar shows that 95% or more of households will see a fall in their income of less than 1.5%. As we said, some will actually see a marginal increase in their living costs. Now, the red line shows that some will see a drop of between 1.5% to 3%. But contrast that to the multiple colors at the bottom. In the struggling estates and difficult circumstances groups, if the Chancellor had not stepped in and if we were right with our assumptions, only a fortunate 2% or less will see a drop of less than 1.5% in their income. Sorry, I'm not pointing at the screen. So that little tiny blue bar. The majority in both of these groups are set to see a drop of between 5 and 7.5%. That's the green here. And for struggling estates, just over 15% are forecast to see a drop in disposable income of where's it gone? Of between 10 and 15%, and a further 6% even more than this. Now, further up the Acorn groups, we also see an alarming amount of color. Generally, anything that's not blue is pretty well bad. Generally, yeah, the more colors, the more concerning. Okay, noticeably, we see that almost 13% of city sophisticates look set to see falls in income of over 10%, despite people generally believing that these are a high earning group. However, many are already on the edge due to their high rents and the combination of increases that could hit them hard. So, whilst this could be a major issue for these groups and the businesses that they rely on them for their income, at least though, the city sophisticates are likely to have at least 3 times the level of savings as those at the bottom of the chart. So whilst things are looking worrying up here, they are particularly worrying down here, where, as we've talked about earlier, the savings aren't there to mitigate the situation. So, I'm a geographer. I like to see what the impact is going to be at a geographical and a map level. So let's see what this scenario would play out at a local authority level across Britain. Okay, so the shading here, the darker the red shading, the bigger the average drop in income within that local authority. We've got a few oddments where we think they could even slightly go up, like the affluent, I think, Mole Valley in Surrey, which is wealthy suburbs. But what we can start to see here is that the 11 biggest falls in terms of household disposable income are likely to be in London. There are 3 boroughs indeed that see an average drop of over £500. So places like Newham, Barking and Dagenham, and Tower Hamlets being particularly affected. And Newham has more than 25% of households that we think risk seeing a fall of more than 10% or more in disposable income. Moving outside London, other English cities lag just behind. We're seeing key areas in Sandwell in Birmingham, Manchester, Nottingham, Luton, Leicester, and Knowsley in Merseyside also making up elements of the top 20 in terms of biggest falls in income. But what we're also seeing is even close to the Chancellor's home, we see big drops, even in places like Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea, both of which have seen an average drop of over £300 and have the highest share of households of about 7%, seeing falls at least 25%. Now, faced by these facts, both across the country and on his own doorstep, the Chancellor clearly felt he had to act. So, now let's see to what extent we believe that the Chancellor has got it right. So, I'm going to start this scenario. This is what you've seen already on the left-hand side. That's what we've already run on the assumption that the fuel and energy price rises happened as they were forced, as they were expected. But what I'm now going to do is put next to it the scenario that assumes the £400 that the Chancellor has given as a rebate to everyone applies across the board. To replicate that, I've basically halved the 40% forecast increase in fuel rises and called it 20%. And this is what we see. So again, the more blue, the better, the fewer colors, the better. A lot of busy noise on there, so let's block a few bits out and help you to walk through it. Okay, so the finances of the broad affluent achiever group, that's the top 3 Acorn groups here, and the category in the middle that we call comfortably communities in the middle, they now look much better. Okay, there is a lot more blue here. Now, this is possibly enough to keep the economy on the move, but there are still small but significant numbers of households in these groups that will still see slight declines. And even within this group, it's noticeable that it is the younger group, the starting out, that seem to be seeing the biggest struggles. Even with the £400 handout, 13% of this group see their incomes drop by between 1.5% and 3%, which could be enough to cause them to get into big trouble. And over 5% are likely to see more than that 3% fall. And remember, from the first part of this webinar, this is a young group that is lacking in savings to cover the costs. But now, let's look at the lower income groups. Here, we can see that while things get better, because there is more blue and less multiple colors as you move right, we are still seeing an alarming amount of color at the bottom. If we revisit the struggling estates, whilst the good news is that the majority no longer see a drop of 5 to 7.5%, what we do see is it only moves one to the left, down to the 3 to 5% mark. Okay, and still almost 40% will see a drop of more than 5% in their disposable incomes. So you can see why the Chancellor had to do more to support the lowest income households. So let's test the scenario of what it would look like if he gave that full additional rebate to every household. To simulate this, I've zeroed the percentage increase for the gas and electricity component to give a third scenario. Again, on the left-hand side, you're seeing my base scenario of before the Chancellor set in. Now we're seeing on the right-hand side what happens if everyone got not just but the £400 rebate, but the means tested additional one. And now we see a much better picture when we contrast this scenario on the right with the baseline on the left. But let's again fade the left chart and focus on key elements of this scenario. This time, many in the top and middle income groups actually start to see a rise in their income. It's almost completely blue. Now, if this was the case, surely this would be seen as unfair and would potentially stimulate even more inflation. So it is not surprising that the Chancellor has not applied the extra payments across all income groups. However, even with this level of rebate may not be enough at the bottom of the income ladder. You can still see quite a lot of colour at the bottom, and struggling estates are still the worst affected. Whilst the good news is there's a lot less colour and the largest group is now the blue band, we still see that 43% see their incomes will drop. Oh, sorry, the largest group, blue band, shows that 43% will see their incomes drop by less than 1.5%. But 43% is still a minority. The majority are still seeing a drop of more than 1.5%, and about 10% will still see a drop of at least 5% in their disposable income. But there is good news in the extra payments in that the biggest falls have now been removed. Whilst our baseline predicted over 6% seeing that disposable income is going to drop by over 15%, this figure has now dropped to less than 0.5%. Now, my understanding is that the extra rebates are available to the lowest income 8 million households. Now, with the bottom 5 Acorn groups representing about 8.5 million households, I have drawn the line here. Now, below the line are those that I've assumed are going to get the extra rebate. The bottom 8 million or so. Above that line, I have applied the other scenario where everyone gets just the £400 rebate. Now, understandably, the Chancellor had to draw the line somewhere. But inevitably, those just above the line are going to begrudge missing out. And this scenario shows what Stuart talked about around that sort of squeezed middle. There are 3 groups here that are still feeling the big hits. Okay, so you've got quite a lot of students, modest means, and starting out, seeing quite high amounts of negative pressure on their disposable income. Meanwhile, those below the line are still never going to thank the Chancellor that despite the fact that he's done something, their income fall is still significant. And whilst they may be doing a lot better under this scenario, many are going to still be facing severe financial pressure. And finally, up near the top, going back to those city certificates, we risk seeing this anomaly of the high rent and mortgage city certificates. They may well really struggle, but they will certainly never earn an extra rebate. Let's just hope that these are the ones that saved money wisely during the pandemic, as they are really likely to need it. So let's start to wrap up. Has the Chancellor got it right? I will let you decide by comparing the base scenario on the left to our best impact of the impacts following his mini budget. And yes, It's a lot more blue, which is a lot more stable, but there is still a lot of color, both at the bottom, the middle, and in those city certificates, if our scenario proves to be correct. So, to wrap up, time has flown by, and I want to have some discussion. So, let's just finish with how to tackle the cost of living crisis with data. So, as with any business problems, until you understand what is happening, I believe you can't understand the risks, and therefore you can't take actions to mitigate those risks. And it's very much the case with the cost of living situation. So, what I would recommend, as we've seen today, there are some good public data sources out there. Use them, but accept their limitations and accept you're going to have to make assumptions and apply those. But also think about using local area data sets, so things like Acorn and PayCheck Disposable Income, because these can help you to understand local needs and the real needs of people on the ground. And it also enables you to start to run predictions of future scenarios by applying assumptions to specific groups. But remember, most of you will also have your own data sources, and it'd be great to discuss this a bit more in detail in a minute, that you can use to help to spot those groups that are at risk. By looking at who is coming into your system that was never there before, by blending that with local area data sets, you can start to see who are the groups that are starting to be in need. And you can use that to model and to predict and make sure that you are able to support the areas that need it. But be aware, this is going to be a journey. It's about tracking changes and keeping on top of it, because yeah, the groups that are impacted first may not be the only ones being affected. So please, we're going to be keeping you posted. We're going to be sharing our monthly tracker from any day now. We'll be publishing our first one. It's all free. We'll hopefully make sure that it is shared on the LARIA newsletters and web feeds. So hopefully we'll give you some additional insights that you can use.